On governance and development. Very delighted to have you with us to reflect on this important subject. My name is Adebayo Olukoshi, immediate past Executive Secretary of the Council for the Development of Social Science Research in Africa, which is sponsoring this panel. And with me here to introduce the session and invite discussion and debate are to my immediate left, Dr. Raufu Mustafa, who teaches at and researches at Queen Elizabeth House, Oxford University, has done quite extensive work on issues of governance and development, both within Africa and in a broader comparative framework. Trained at Ahmadu Bello University in Zaria and proceeded to carry out his doctoral studies at Oxford University, where he's also currently based. To my extreme left, but not ideologically, is Professor Adam Habib, who is currently the Deputy Vice Chancellor for Research at the Johannesburg University. Adam has had many lives professionally, including a stint as the Director of the Center for Civil Society at the University of KwaZulu-Natal in Durban, a center which he led and gave visibility on a continental and global scale, before proceeding to the Human Sciences Research Council of South Africa in Pretoria, where he was also executive director, responsible for the governance, democracy, politics unit of the council. And then from there, recently was named Deputy Vice Chancellor for Research at the University of Johannesburg. Well, if you watch South African television, you'll see that he's a very familiar figure on television, commenting on issues of governance, democracy, and development in the South African context, but also engaging broader continental concerns. Regrettably, our colleague Harry Singh from the Asian Political and International Studies Association is unable to be with us here today, and we'll do our best to fill the gap created by Harry's absence. He, of course, has done quite extensive work also on issues of democracy and governance in Asia, including the so-called Asian model of democracy, around which Mahathir Mohamad and others had generated debate a few years ago. The idea of this panel is to revisit an old concern of the interface between governance and development. And as was summarized in the program, which was circulated to all of us, what we define as the underlying question and concern for this panel is the nature of the interface. What kinds of governance regimes and relationships might be necessary in order to secure development. Well, of course, this is not a new concern. This is a concern which in many ways is in fact generic to the preoccupation of most of us social scientists. But in terms of its more recent usage in our debates and discussions, at least going back to the last 20 years, a whole set of concerns together with an accompanying literature has developed, which we need to engage in a more direct way, with a view hopefully to transcending some of the limitations in the dominant literature that informs the quest for a better understanding of the interface between governance and development. And what I will try to do in my introductory remarks will be to try to trace the intellectual history, as it were, of the discussions around governance and development in a fairly stylized way, but hopefully in a way which will also help us to focus our discussions. And then Raufu will come in with, I guess, in the same broad vein, looking at the particular context of Africa much more extensively, relationship between statecraft and the rebuilding of the African state in the quest for a developmentalist form of governance. Adam Habib will have the task of tying all of this together and drawing on his own experience in the field in order to then introduce questions for debate. I hope that we will have plenty of time for discussion. The absence of Harry Singh means that we can probably take a few more minutes to elaborate on our presentations, but give also adequate time for discussion. I was in a panel yesterday where Paul Collier and others presented, and they took all the time presenting. There was 5 minutes for discussion. We will avoid that. Good governance, democratic governance demands that we allow for as much debate and discussion so that we can really have a truly fulfilling exchange and make your participation in this panel worthwhile for you as for us. So if this is fine, let me kick off by looking at the broad issues that have shaped the discussion on governance and development in recent times. And as I indicated earlier in my introductory remarks, the governance question has enjoyed a new lease on life in recent times, in the last 20 years, as the question of the regime types, state forms, even broad political conditions under which development might take place have come back to the fore of intellectual but also of policy concerns around the world, particularly in the countries of the global south. But it is always important for us to remind ourselves that even if the current discussion might be traced back to the last 20, 25 years of especially structural adjustment economic reforms around the countries of the global south, we need to be reminded that the governance concern is at the heart of much of what we do as social scientists, whether as political scientists interested in looking at the question of the state and of power and how it is managed, or as sociologists who are interested in looking at how legitimacy might be mobilized for regimes and how state-society relations may be configured. Almost without exception, various disciplines of the social sciences have been preoccupied with questions of governance to the extent to which they have been involved in trying to understand the nature, the use, and the consequences of power on people and on the broader developmental process. But beyond this generic usage, it seems to me that the more recent history can be understood in the context of the quest for securing World Bank, IMF structural adjustment reforms in the countries of the global south. And there's an important distinction to be made between this recent preoccupation and the more generic social science preoccupation, which is an ongoing engagement with questions of governance. Because whereas for the political scientist, for the sociologist, for the historian interested in looking at regime types over time, the governance problematic was not necessarily defined as a problem peculiar to one region of the world, to one people, to one set of countries, broadly defined as developing countries. The more recent debate of the last 20, 25 years has tended to understand the governance problematic and the interface between governance and development in terms of what is considered to be pathologies of development in particular regions of the world. So that almost in a very crude way, one could argue that a lot of the discussion assumes, even if it does not state this upfront, that the governance question has been resolved in certain parts of the world. It is now left for this, for other regions of the world where the governance concerns remains an issue to either catch up with the standards that have been set in other parts of the world or resolve those problems of governance that affect the prospects for development. And I think perhaps this is one of the key problems with the nature of the governance development debate as it is set in the current period. Yesterday when we were discussing Paul Collier, you'll find that in fact the very language of engagement with the pathologies that are identified as being problematic to the governance development interface in the so-called developing countries, or what Paul Collier calls the bottom billion, is a pathology of them. It's about them and how they can better be like us, right? Their states did not emerge from Darwinian survival situations, so their states did not really have not had the challenges necessary to build the kind of security infrastructure that were built in Europe. And effectively, what we then begin to see is a discourse of governance which cancels out contradictions in the experiences of one region of the world, presents those experiences as a uniform, almost monolithic model against which the performance and actual ongoing processes in another region of the world would be measured in order to see whether they stand up to the standard of scrutiny that is defined by those. So it's an important methodological point which I would like us to keep in mind as we go through this intellectual, even policy and political context of the more recent usage of the concept of governance. At the time, the countries of the global south moved into economic crisis in the late 1970s, a crisis which was in many ways signaled by the so-called Mexican weekend of 1982, when Mexico formally defaulted on its debt and triggered a series of reactions that resulted in balance of payments difficulties, which eventually were refracted into the very structural workings of the economies of most developing countries to produce the crisis that we came to live with from the beginning of the 1980s onwards. There was, in fact, an ongoing discussion in the different regions of the South around the governance development interface. In the specific African context, that discussion was organized principally on the platform of the Council for the Development of Social Science Research in Africa, CODESRIA, which sponsors this panel, as well as the African Association of Political Science, right? The two leading social science continental platforms where scholars from the continent were beginning to think through the dilemmas and challenges of post-colonial development in Africa, and to ask themselves the question, what went wrong and how might this be corrected? And the very concept of governance, the very notion of governance used for the first time in discourses around the world emanated out of the debates animated by the likes of Achi Mafeji, George Nzongola, Peter Anyang-Nyong'o, and the rest of them, who argued that the problem which seemed to confront the continent in its quest to build democracy and development post-independence, for all of the progress which was made and in recognition of all of the difficulties encountered, was that somehow the question of state-society relations had not yet been solved in a democratic manner. And so the challenge which was posed to Africa was one of how to get the politics right. And if you look at the publications of Claude Ake, the three books which Claude Ake issued before his death in the late 70s into the late 1980s, he summarizes a lot of the debates and discussions around this concern as defined by the African context. In the context of Latin America, the debate was itself not too dissimilar to the African context insofar as it had to do with the configuration of state-society relations in a context in which the dictatorships and the banana republics, so-called, of the post-1945 period had also begun to run their course in the context of the end of the Cold War, and the need to establish a new balance between state and society that will allow for a democratic opening which will recognize the importance and role of social movements and legitimate their action in reshaping society and the distribution of power and resources in society, was itself very much on the agenda of discussion. In Asia, it was a question of how to move beyond the kinds of dictatorship that delivered development but denied democracy in very fundamental ways. And some of the attention in that context was paid to the role which the middle classes might play in opening up the political systems in Asia, whilst securing the developmental gains that had been achieved over the period. What the World Bank did in entering into the governance discussion in the 1980s was in fact to embrace the concept of governance, much like I think what it does with a lot of good ideas, and then to proceed to twist it in a way that changed both its meaning and its content, to rob it of politics, to technocratize it as much as possible, and effectively to turn it into an instrument for securing structural adjustment rather than for challenging the very the very assumptions upon which the model of adjustment which it favored was built. I'll unpack this a bit. When the World Bank launched the structural adjustment programs for the recovery of the economies of the countries of the South, it defined the challenge which the countries of the South, the developing countries, so-called, were confronted with in terms of the need to get prices right. This is to be contrasted with the debate that was taking place in Africa at the time, where our concern was, in fact, how to get the politics right. It was not so much a question of prices, but a question of how you discipline power to democratize it in order to get more effective citizen participation of the kind that will carry the continent beyond the post-colonial authoritarianism that had itself reached a dead end by the end of the 1970s, where single-party regimes and military governments may have remained in power but had lost all popular legitimacy and could no longer exercise effective authority without resort to extensive coercion and unleashing of violence. The World Bank argued that what Africa needed was to get prices right. And inspired by the Berg report, the report of Elliot Berg and others, a complete contrast to the blueprint that had been adopted for the recovery of African economies, the Lagos Plan of Action and the Final Act of Lagos, proceeded to codify the recommendations of the Berg report into the structural adjustment framework that then was spread across the continent as a one-size-fits-all solution to the problems of economic development confronting African countries. The same thing played itself out in Latin America and to a lesser extent in the countries of Asia that were going through different kinds of crises. Now, there was, of course, a peculiar political economy analysis. It called itself a political economy analysis that underpinned the very notion of getting prices right. And that political economy analysis essentially defined the state as the problem in African development and proceeded to identify what it considered to be key characteristics of state interventionist development and politics in Africa that essentially suggested that neo-patrimonialism was the very driving force of power, politics, and decision-making on the continent. And the statism that was built around neo-patrimonialism could only be overcome by introducing market liberalization, allowing free rein to the forces of the market, and simultaneously rolling back the frontiers of the state, cutting it down to size, and in some cases actually abolishing key institutions of the state in a way that would allow unfettered reign for the forces of the market. There's a lot to be said about this particular political economy, and I don't propose, it's something which I think many of us in this audience have grappled with in our analysis over a period of time. I don't propose to go into a full discussion of the content of structural adjustment, except to note that the idea of the World Bank and across the continent, including people like Paul Collier, across the continent, what we were told was that structural adjustment was going to be a short-term intervention that will enable African economies to recover themselves within a space of 3 years. There was actually no adjustment agreement that went beyond 3 years, although we began to have SAP 1, adjustment 1, adjustment 2, adjustment 3, itself suggesting the failure of the earlier intervention and stabilization approaches that were adopted, but also pointing to the fact that rather than being a temporary diversion from development, the structural adjustment model in the workings of the IMF and the World Bank, as well as bilateral donors, became the very fulcrum around which an attempt was made to organize development that would be market-driven, that would be disciplined to the forces of the market. A decade on, that approach did not yield the results that were expected. Structural adjustments, in a lot of cases, did not even succeed in stabilizing economies, let alone putting them back on the path of recovery and growth. Except in purely rhetorical terms, the bank itself had to undertake serious internal assessment as to why structural adjustment was not working. Right? In much of the discourse, ideological discourse of the bank and its new political economies adherents in various universities across the US in particular, there was the argument that Africa had wasted the first 2 decades of independence. And yet when the statistics looking at the performance of African economies in the first 2 decades of independence are put side by side on social front, on political front, on the economic front, even in terms of simple output, GDP growth and all, it was quite clear that the performance of African economies over the period of the first 2 decades of independence was far superior to anything that was achieved in the first decade of structural adjustment. Right? Even in terms of the rates of growth that we are talking about, let's not forget that Kenya and Cote d'Ivoire were described as economic miracles, right, in the 60s, into the early 70s, by the same bank as well as the same intellectuals who later on forgot their own qualification of those economies and proceeded to call them basket cases, coming out of an experience of complete wastage. And the best that the World Bank was able to achieve in terms of growth over the period of the first decade of structural adjustment across the board on the continent was in fact never beyond the rate of population growth. Best performing economies never grew faster than the rate of the growth of their population, so that effectively African economies were in a state of either direct and complete regression or at best stagnation over the period of a decade, the first decade of structural adjustment. The internal assessment which the bank itself undertook was what led it to embrace governance as a key challenge. And the metaphor that was employed was a very straightforward one from Shakespeare, that after a decade of structural adjustment, the bank realized that having structural adjustment without a program of governance was like asking Shakespeare to produce Hamlet without the Prince of Denmark. So structural adjustment and governance were supposed to be two sides of the same coin, that you could not have meaningful, successful adjustment if you did not have a governance component to address what the bank considered to be the governance obstacles that militated against successful adjustments. This analysis came out of the Sub-Saharan Africa from Growth to Sustainable Development that was issued in 1989, a synthesis report which the bank produced and which was widely distributed to signal a change in direction. I think it's important also to point out that before then, again, similar to some of the kinds of things that Paul Collier and others, Paul Collier was part of all of that, that group, the bottom billion, producing bottom billions to come and talk about them later. First of all, starting with an analysis in 1984-85 that suggested that actually structural adjustment was working, only you needed a bit of time for it to work its way through the system and for the results to the new so-called sunshine industries to begin to blossom to restore Africa to the path of growth. That line of analysis ran its course, and the bank proceeded to then undertake a series of methodological gymnastics, essentially arguing that it was necessary to compare those countries that had structural adjustment with those countries that did not have structural adjustment, with adjustment and without adjustment. And they proceeded to run tables, right? Except that the choice of examples of with and without adjustment was highly, I'm looking for a diplomatic word. It was a manipulation of cases, essentially. And this was pointed out by an army of critics of the bank who said that this was actually doing injustice to basic methodology in the social sciences. And then they proceeded from with and without to a before and after, to say that before adjustment, this was the condition of country X. After adjustment, look at the condition to show that there was progress being registered. Again, this really did not fly with much of the scientific community, and ultimately the governance card was brought to the fore. But this was done without any attention being paid to the content of economic policy, to the direction of economic policy as codified in the structural adjustment programs. The very model of adjustment that was in contention was considered still up to that point to be an impeccable model of adjustment. All you needed to do was to find the political regime that will secure that model and that will produce the kinds of results that you needed. The World Bank became a convert to democracy, but its chief economist for Africa at that time also issued a statement to the Conference of African of economists working in the Africa division, telling them matter-of-factly, to be realistic, that only effective, ruthless governments, I'm quoting him, effective, ruthless governments capable of riding roughshod over public opinion can succeed in pushing structural adjustment. And so we begin to see the instrumentalization of governance as an instrument in the hands of policymakers in multilateral institutions to try to secure an economic policy framework that was not delivering results and on top of it was highly unpopular with the generality of the population. And the very elements of the measurement of governance which the bank was then to proceed to define, which included transparency, rule of law, property rights, the media, the judiciary, and even more recently, central bank independence as a measure of good governance. All of these were essentially technical instruments that were made, that were developed to try to tighten the very framework of adjustment that was itself the object of contention. Now, I want to argue that although with the arrival of Stiglitz at the bank, the adjustment model began to be questioned from within, and there might be something to the fact that Joseph Stiglitz was probably appointed to the position of the chief economist after Larry Summers, made the three speeches on the post-Washington consensus, the Washington, the Helsinki, and the Geneva speeches, where he critiqued in the same terms and the same language that extremists like us had used to criticize the structural adjustment program. Almost you could accuse Stiglitz of plagiarism in terms of the exactness and similarity of words and of arguments deployed in critiquing structural adjustment from within the World Bank as chief economist of the World Bank. That you could probably see an attempt to rejig the model. But I think the fact that Stiglitz himself was ousted from his position in the World Bank was indicative of the resilience of that model. The World Bank today would say that, well, the issue is no longer about structural adjustment. We recognize that we made mistakes. Paul Collier doesn't recognize that he made mistakes. He was also one of the he was the chief economist of the Africa division of the World Bank that created many more people into the bottom billion, that he is now coming to talk about how to rescue with gunboats, military intervention, international civil provision authority, and all kinds of proposals that are contained in his various writings. A lot of the claim to have recognized the mistakes of the adjustment years does not include an acceptance of responsibility for the errors that were made. And I think it's important for us in rethinking governance and in trying to go beyond the impact of World Bank, IMF, and broad donor adjustment policies on the governance of African countries, to recognize that even if structural adjustment did not succeed, and even if the authors of structural adjustment recognized that their policies were misguided and did not work, it did have an impact. And that impact is what Thandika has described as the maladjustment of Africa, that has also produced a malaise of governance on the continent that we need to respond to. What is that malaise of governance? Now, it's well and good to say that African states do not have the capacity to deliver basic services. But that capacity was eroded deliberately. It was the World Bank and the IMF that proceeded to dismantle the African states and to put forward the proposition that what Africa needed was to have a watchman state, a night watchman state, a security state that would simply cater to the security of life and property and have nothing to do with anything else, not even the provision of services. The first line of attack on the state was, in fact, the erosion of the social expenditure of the state, as well as the institutions that were key and central to the social provisioning that was central to the definition of state-society relations and the post-colonial social contract in Africa, as in Latin America and parts of Asia. And I think it's important for us to keep this in mind. People sometimes grapple with proposals that come from people like Paul Collier as though they are abstract and floating in the air. I would in fact argue that a lot of their proposals is a rearguard battle to try to save a failed and discredited framework of policy making for which they don't even have the humility as individuals to accept personal responsibility in the first instance. Now, you don't need to create a service delivery independent authority with donors sitting on the board to supply food and to supply water and to build roads in any country if you have a meaningful state in place. And if that state has been dismantled, the challenge of governance that is posed today is how to rebuild that state in order for it to perform the roles that it ought to perform in the first place, and which we were misled to abandon in the first place. When Peter Gibbon, at the height of the dismantling of the state, wrote an interesting article looking at Tanzania, which he had studied for many years, and titled it, "Everything is for Sale," everything that belonged to the state. Everything is for sale, including the state house. This was the kind of privatization that was promoted by the World Bank. What could not be privatized was to be dismantled and liquidated. And even what was privatized was just given away without any attention given to the investments that had been made over a period of time. In terms of the legitimacy of the state itself, again, it's all well and good for the Colliers to come and tell us that, the African state has no legitimacy. international peacekeepers are even more acceptable than others. But legitimacy is the product of a whole complex of relations and factors. And at the end of the millennium, at the end of the 20 years of structural adjustment, it was very clear to the average African as to the average Latin American that there was really very little bargain in being the citizen of any given country, because the state actually had been made to abdicate all responsibility. And on top of it, there was a mindless reallocation of resources taking place that produced the kinds of inequalities, which again we see illustrated in the bottom billion and others, but was a direct product of deliberate policy and which was to be secured through the so-called governance policies that included an emphasis on property rights as a primary issue in policy making. Scholars, economists across the world, political economists, have attempted to show that there's actually no correlation between so-called good governance and your capacity to attract investment. For everything that was recommended for African countries, take China, and you'll find that China deviates from all of them and was the biggest magnet of investment from around the world. Danny Roderick and others have made a very convincing time series analysis over a period of time, looking at various case examples to try to illustrate this. I think at the end of the day, rethinking governance in Africa and seeking to take it beyond the very narrow technocratic confines to which the bank and others confined it will require us also to dismantle the very framework of social and economic policy making, and to ensure that we recapture the policy spaces in many of the countries of Africa. For over 2.5 decades of structural adjustment, policy making was essentially driven from outside the continent. What Paul Collier proposes to continue to do is to run policy from outside the African continent. And yet, at the same time, we are told, well, we recognize that we made mistakes, that the model and the approach which we pursued were not really helpful to the development of African countries. You cannot develop a continent if the governance of the policy processes and of the policy institutions of that country are completely divorced from citizen control and oversight. It's a very elementary thing that we learn in politics and which is important for us to restore in African countries. In the end, I would argue that, in fact, the task of governance that confronts African countries and those of Latin America, as we see with the rebirth of social movements in places like Bolivia, in places like Mexico with the Chiapas movement, Zapatista movement, in places like Venezuela with Hugo Chavez's unique style of trying to make his point and play the politics of the point that he seeks to make around these issues, in Ecuador, in Nicaragua, all those sites around the world where the discontent against neoliberalism of a fundamentalist kind really have reached their nadir. It's important for us to recognize that the key governance challenge is that of development and democracy, and that the state and statecraft constitute an important element of the attempt to secure development and to advance the frontiers of democracy. And it's this kind of rethinking, I believe, that will enable us to separate ourselves from the very narrow technocratic frames of the IMF and the World Bank on the one hand, which happily is sufficiently discredited that even the bank and the funds don't talk in the name of adjustment anymore, but also to be able to tackle and take on Paul Collier and his disciples and clones around the world for all of the sophistry. Yeah, they speak for the poor now. They position themselves as the spokespersons for the poor in Africa, the bottom billion of the world, but in fact proposing policies which assault everything that is dignified about human beings and which speak to freedom and democracy around the world. I think this is the challenge we are confronted with. I thank you for your patience, and sorry I went on for too long. May I now invite Raufu Mustafa to make his presentation, and then Adam Habib.
Thank you very much, Bayo. In many respects, my presentation also map onto some of the concerns that Bayo has raised in his paper. I share with him the concern about the connection between knowledge and power and the way this has worked itself out in the past 2 decades on the African continent. And I also share with him the sense in which the African state and the way we understand it is at the center of the, if you like, social and political drama that have taken place on the African continent over those two decades. In many respects, the state has always been key to the African imagination. Right from the times of people like Nkrumah, capturing the state was seen as central to social progress in the post-colonial period. And much of what happened, both the good and the bad, the use and the abuse of the state was central to the African experience of the post-colonial period. In that sense, therefore, it's not surprising that the understandings of the state is also key to adjustment, as Bayo has tried to explain, but in many respects also key to our understanding of questions of governance. And I suggest also how we look at the state and understand the state is key to how Africa goes into the future, if it's to address some of the key existential problems that face the majority of Africa's peoples. So the state is an important instrument in our imagination of social policy in Africa in the context of that connection between knowledge and power. Historically, the state was seen as an instrument of social progress in the post-colonial period. But what is also clear is that by the late 70s, for reasons both internal and external, that state was beginning to run into a series of buffers, both political and economic. Buffers which were beginning to question both the effectiveness and the legitimacy of the post-colonial state. Models of development, statist models around import substitution, the 5-year plans, labor and financial market regulation, all of these were coming into, if you like, crisis of one sort or the other. And all of these were seen as indicative of government failure in the context of African development. And it's precisely these problems that set the stage for the denunciation of state intervention or the role of the state in post-colonial Africa. Nationalist developmentalist ideology was regarded as the problem. And in many respects, this ideology of nationalism and development was considered as dead and buried from about the early 1980s. And instead, as Bayo has clearly explained, what we see is an advocacy of the market as the solution to the malfunction of the state. Fiscal and monetary austerity, rolling back of the state, dismissing civil servants, dismantling many institutions, including, in some cases, in places like Sierra Leone, removing rail lines and selling of the metal as scrap, elimination of subsidies, squeezing down taxation, you name it, a whole raft of policies were put forward under the guise of addressing state failure or governmental failure through privatization, deregulation, and liberalization. The logic of the state of structural adjustment, therefore, was that the African state was the problem, it was not needed. It was obsolete. And I think you only have to live in a society without a state to recognize the fallacy of this kind of thinking and this kind of logic. But what I want to draw out here is the connection between that thinking and the challenges we face today. And these are some of the things also that Amartya Sen so graphically and so brilliantly raised in his opening talk at the beginning of this conference. At the root of that particular idea of the African state under adjustment was an understanding of human motivation. What motivates people, and what motivates African leaders, and what are they up to? And we need to come to terms with that in order to be able to understand what governance is all about and the challenges that governance poses today in the contemporary situation. The way in which the international financial institutions understood human motivation in the context of adjustment was that everything was about self-aggrandizement. It's greed and the need to build personal and class accumulation that was key to what African elites were doing. Fundamental to this view, therefore, was a notion of the state as the arena of collusive and corrupt elites. A state whose actions were characterized almost exclusively by rent-seeking and by corruption, both of which led to inefficiencies in their allocation and stunted economic growth. The politics of adjustment was therefore an attempt, if you like, to disperse power away from the state. In some cases to a hypothetical civil society, and in some cases effectively to technocrats in Washington and other parts of the globe. Key to that logic was the sense that these African elites cannot be trusted with power because they were driven by motives of rent-seeking and corruption. Within this particular framing of the understanding of politics and the state, there are two important things that I want to draw attention to. One is the fact that ordinary people are seen purely as objects of power, not actors in their own right. And secondly, public motivation, nationalism, community development, altruistic motivations are greeted with suspicion and distanced. So therefore, as Bayo explained, the notion of the African state under adjustment was essentially a destructive one. Dismantle it, diffuse power, and in a sense, hand things over to the market. If you get the price right, that will take care of the problem. Now, this is, of course, the first set of adjustment, the first set of reforms. The reforms dealing with rolling back the state and the like. But when this didn't work, we moved to the second set of reforms, the governance reforms. Because it was realized, as Bayo quite rightly pointed out, that getting the price right wasn't good enough. You also had to get the institutions right. You needed the Prince of Denmark if we are going to stage Hamlet. So you needed the institutions if we are going to carry out the adjustment. So along with the good policies of restrictive microeconomic management, you needed the good institutions of democracy, of a good bureaucracy, effective bureaucracy, independent judiciary, protection of property rights, transparent financial institutions, and corporate governance. That's the second set of reforms. What this set of reforms emphasize is an improvement in institutional quality. In their own term, nobody will argue against improved institutional quality, but it's the way in which this sits with other reform agenda, and this sits with other debates and other efforts in the society, that I think that's where the problem really comes. Good governance essentially was seen as an instrument of constraining that rent-seeking elite. Now that it was recognized that you needed the state, you needed a state that protected property and constrained corruption, constrained the elite. Subsequently, poverty alleviation was added onto the agenda. And with this, you had the delivery of services to address poverty, and the emergence of what some have referred to as service delivery states. The service delivery state in Africa, therefore, comes from, I think, some of these streams. On the one hand, you have the adjustment stream, which remains, even if not part of the discourse anymore. On the other hand, you have the governance stream, which is an attempt to create the institutions to make adjustment possible. And on the third hand, you have the poverty alleviation stream, which is an attempt to give adjustment a human face, to borrow a popular phrase from some of its critics. So that the African state we have today comes as a consequence of these two sets of reforms, and is a product of very specific, if you like, international financial institution lending practices, administrative reforms, and discursive shaping. That is how we come by the kind of state we have today on the continent. My major concern in this presentation, again, something which I share with Bayo, is that there's a disconnect between that state and the requirements for African development. It's not working. And we need to understand why, and we need to understand what needs to be done about it. What is clear, looking at Africa after the decade or two of adjustment, is that in fact many African countries continue to face severe developmental crisis today, despite all of these reforms and the social costs involved. Economists like Nkandawire and Howard Stein have documented this as economists do, with data and time series and all whatnot. The reality, no matter how you look at it, is that adjustment governance does not sit well with developmental needs on that continent. Data have been put forward to look at patterns of capital flows, trade flows, national saving rates, official debts, per capita calorie supply. All of these point in that single direction, that these reforms have not addressed the needs of the African peoples. To quote Howard Stein, the only conclusion we can reach after all this series of adjustments is that Africa, I quote, has not done well in the era of adjustment and globalization, having looked at all the data available on those criteria. What is also noteworthy is that even in places where you've had some growth, South Africa may be one of them, this has come at high social costs of increased inequality, social tensions, and environmental degradation. Similarly, because of the emphasis, equation of politics with greed, politics with economic irrationality, the attempt to shield social policy institutions from politics has effectively depoliticized vital social institutions on the continent and emasculated the abilities of African people to influence the institutions that they need to govern themselves. So either in terms of the economic criteria, social criteria or political criteria, adjustment has created significant problems on the continent. And this is when people like Chang argue that development crisis, I quote, development crisis in many developing countries have reached a scale that is now threatening the basic fabric of their societies. Africa seems to me to fit quite neatly into this particular description after the 2 decades of adjustment. Now, there is no reason to believe that this kind of states we have in Africa today is capable of transcending this scenario that I've created. These states may have cleaned up some malfeasance, but they can do very little else. They cannot transform the situation that they have created. And I think this is where the challenge between governance and development comes in. How do you provide development in a context in which governance only reproduces underdevelopment and poverty, in which people increasingly are dependent on aid, and in which people are confronted by all kind of fanciful scenario of bringing in foreign troops and foreign technocrats to provide even the most basic of social services? How can a society survive on such a model in the 21st century? I think one of the reasons why these current states in Africa cannot transform is precisely because of some of those foundational reasons that inform the way in which adjustment was brought in and governance was brought in. The fact that African elites were seen as corrupt and greedy and nothing else meant, for instance, that the state never made common cause with local agents. The adjusting state in Africa was a floating phenomenon, literally, without any roots in society. Because, according to Mkandawire, it couldn't come to terms with actually existing capitalism. A state interested in promoting accumulation should at least make common cause with the accumulators in that society, not with foreign technocrats. But in the adjusting state in Africa, as we say it, that didn't happen. This and so many other reasons are why, in fact, that state is incapable of overcoming its limitations, and why we need to move beyond it. Again, economists like Stein have argued that what we need, in fact, is not getting the price right or monetary stabilization. What we need is to go back to that earlier debate that Bayo referred to among African political scientists largely, about governance. Governance as accountability, governance as societal control of the state. And this then naturally points us in the direction of the nature of the state and how we can build states that take care not just of governance but also of development, so that we can have an endogenous response to Africa's problems. Now, once we think of our challenge in this way, we must look at the connection between the state, the market, and society, both historically and in the contemporary period. We don't necessarily have to reinvent the wheel. There's a lot of experience of other societies we can learn from, but we can translate this experience into our own immediate challenges and see ways in which they help us to get out of the dilemma in which we find ourselves. So my first argument is that Africa does need states, effective states, not rolled back states, not night watchman states, but entrepreneurial states that engage with the economy, that engage with the society, and that engage with the market. That's my first argument. And we must necessarily go beyond that argument that the market is primary. That notion that somehow the market is natural and everything else is man-made and therefore not as good as the market. For the simple reason, as many have pointed out from Polanyi downwards, that the market itself is a political construct, and therefore we cannot present it as some kind of a historical element that will sit over the African landscape. The African state should engage with the market to structure it, to create it, but also should engage with society and should engage with the building of the institutions necessary. So we need an entrepreneurial state. We need a state that is different from the old post-colonial state with its array of parastatals and all the, if you like, import substitution limitations. We need a state that can can coordinate economic actors, both private and public, and can induce them to go in particular directions. That's one job of coordination, not of domination of the economy. We need a state that has a vision of where that coordination is leading. We need a state that can manage conflict effectively, democratically, and we need a state that builds institutions that can then engage, share with it all of these tasks. And when you put it in this way, one, that we need a state beyond the night watchman state, beyond the state that prevents corruption, but a state that also tries to carry out development and do it in these 4 ways I've pointed out. We see that, in fact, we are talking of a state system that is different from the current, if you like, states that are so prominent on the continent. We need a state that can engage in infrastructural development, that can engage in licensing of economic activities, which necessarily involves rents. Let's face it, you need rents to accumulate. It's a question of who does the accumulation and what they do with it. We need a state that generates a regulatory framework that protects society against the excesses of the economy and the capitalists. We need a state with a vision of its place, both in terms of its society and its position in the world. A state that will contribute to the construction of the market, not the domination of the economy. A state that is conscious of the need to tackle social problems through promoting growth and accumulation. And a state that also recognizes the need to build alliances within and without African society, not just in Washington, but also in the village, with little farmers, little traders, little transporters, and finding the platforms on which to tap into their energies and their vision to make possible a society in which the dignity of the ordinary people can be promoted and protected, which is not what's happening in many parts of the continent today. So in a sense, we need to think of the institutions of the state, the market, and society in new ways, different from what the current state in Africa is doing. We need not just a state that is constraining corrupt elites, so-called, but a state that is also promoting, if you like, a vision of society and doing it in a much better way than the immediate post-colonial state did. If we want to put a label on this, we could call this a democratic developmental state, like some have done. It's a state that recognizes the need to promote growth, to manage the economy, to promote institutions that are both embedded on one hand and effective and autonomous on the other, that promotes necessary linkages between the society and the state, and that mobilizes the energy of the society to address issues of economic opportunities and globalization. Now, that is not the state we currently have, but I'm not suggesting for a minute that every African state can go in this direction. The problem, however, is that current orthodoxy makes it difficult for even those who can to go in that direction, and that is what I suggest that we need to be removing if Africa is to overcome its contemporary problems. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Raufu. I would like to give the floor to Adam Habib to introduce the discussion. And then we'll open up for a debate.
Well, thank you very much. This is a real pleasure to be here, and it's a real pleasure to be able to be a discussant on this panel. This is the second panel that has discussed this issue. I was at the Paul Collier's panel yesterday, and I was the debate that flowed out of that was fairly vibrant and robust, and I hope that it's going to be as vibrant and robust at this panel. I'm not going to cover the same ground that both Bayo and Raufu did, which is, I think, a very powerful critique of the economic experimentation on the African continent over the last 2 to 3 decades and the failures of that. And I think I agree to, I just wanted to make one point there, which Raufu touched on, which is on the South African context. That often in the debate, you will find that the great success story of orthodoxy in the current contemporary period is South Africa, that you would hear. And people would say to you that South Africa has achieved, which it has, is growth rates for the last 15 years, and it's the longest period of growth in the South African history. That is true, but much of that growth has to effectively do with the inclusion of a new group of citizens as a result of democratization. And if you look at all of the African countries or all of the countries post-decolonization that actually happened, as new citizens were included as a result of political processes into the economy, those societies underwent a fairly dramatic growth rate. What is interesting about South Africa is that it is much lower in a growth rate than any of the other African countries in the first decade of colonization. It is much lower than the average African country in its first period of decolonization. So South Africa's economic success, if compared to the first decade of decolonization, is not a success, it's a failure. And if you equate that with the fact that South Africa's success was meant to be in a period of global economic boom, then it's a double failure. And I think that often this is misunderstood in this debate, and it's worth making that point. Because often in the contemporary, if you listen to IMF and World Bank, they'll give you South Africa as the great success story. When actually, if you do the appropriate comparisons, you come to a very different conclusion. But that's not what I wanted to focus on, because I think that the critique has been a fairly useful one. What I want to start off with is where Raufu ended, which is the democratic development state. And I think that there are 2 questions that emerge from that. The first is, what does it mean, which he touched on and he explained. And the second is, how do we bring it into effect in this context? And I just wanted to throw some ideas out as a means to open up the conversation. I think what both Raufu and what Bayo made the point is their entire thesis is based on 2 assumptions. And I think it's worthwhile bringing those assumptions to the fore. The first is that good policy is not the product of good technocrats. And it's never the product of good leaders. And actually, it's amazing how much of the policy literature assumes that. That if you had the right technocrats, and if you had the right leaders, and you just get the right people in power, that suddenly development would happen. And what they're saying is got very little to do with good technocrats. That's not to be, that doesn't mean we shouldn't have good economists or good technocrats or good leaders. But what it says is that good technocrats or leaders are not the foundation of good development. It's a necessary but not a sufficient condition. And that's the first thing that they say. The second point that both of them make, which came out in yesterday's panel, at the second presentation on Scandinavia, was, I thought a powerful, this thing, is that comparative lessons must be taken into account. But learning does not mean imitation. And I think it's a very powerful assumption, lesson to be learned from yesterday's panel, that actually learning does not mean imitation. And again, I think a large amount of the policy literature and academic literature which speaks about development assumes that learning means imitation. And I think that that's something that we would do a lot to bear in mind. And so it seems to be what we need is systemic conditions. What is the systemic conditions? That's the lesson to learn. What is the systemic conditions that can foster the emergence of the development state that Raouf was talking about? And for me, there are two elements about that. And I think that that's what I would like to just put onto the table. The first element, which has been touched upon, is about accountability. It's about how do we empower citizens against state elites? How do we make state elites accountable, responsive to the interests of citizens? And that isn't by pleading with them, but it's by empowering citizens themselves. That's the first thing. And if you looked at yesterday's case study on the Scandinavia, one of the things that that case study said is the Scandinavian development part was effectively one of wage compression. And that wage compression was effectively a result of the power of labor in the Scandinavian society. And so it seems to be that power and the configuration of how do you empower citizens in the process so state elites can become responsive to them. So that's the first empowerment exercise that you need. But there is a second empowerment exercise to achieve the African the development state, the democratic development state. And it is how do you empower the state against external actors? Because actually you cannot understand the crisis of the 70s and 80s without understanding the Cold War and the proxy wars that took place all over the continent as a result of a Cold War dynamic between the United States and the Soviet Union. You just can't understand it. You can't understand the disaster of Angola or Mozambique without understanding the proxy wars of this thing. So you have to start looking at how do you empower, first, how do you empower citizens against the state elites? But second, how do you empower the state's elites against international actors like the IFIs, like a global capital, and like predatory foreign powers? Because that is also so you actually need a double empowerment exercise. One within of society against state elites, and the second of state elites against predatory foreign powers and international. And that's what I wanted to put some ideas on here. How do we do the empowerment of citizens? How do we empower society against state? Because that's how you create the accountability dynamic of power. Well, if you read Mafeje, if you read Claude Ake, and if you read a number of other scholars, what you need is mobilization of people. You need social movements. Social movements are absolutely a powerful element in this thing. That struggles, the current contemporary struggles, which is viewed with suspicion in our range of circles, are actually struggles that we should welcome, because in part they create the possibilities for empowerment. So social movements is one element of that equation. But the second element of that equation is how do you make political elites a product of electoral choice? So you have two elements to that. One is social movements, social struggle. And the second is making political elites a product of electoral choice. And as you got this interesting dynamic in the debate about democracy, is it participatory or representative? Well, it's a complex of both. That's the thing. It's a mixture of both. And that's something that I think has to be understood. Effectively, what you're doing is you're diversifying and pluralizing power in society. But you're not doing it to other elites. You're doing it to citizens groups themselves. That's what the first empowerment exercise is about. And it seems to me that that's what we need to think through, is how do we start looking at that empowerment exercise? The second is how do you empower the states against external actors? And here I have three suggestions, which I think again has been drawn from the literature. The first is continental and regional collaboration and integration. It's absolutely crucial. And it's not crucial because it legitimizes rules or it creates a set of responsibilities. It's crucial because it enhances local states' power. It prevents foreign powers from playing local powers against each other, local African states against each other. By creating a regional integration exercise, you create the conditions, you create the empowerment against the external. That's the real power of China. Because what China has when it engages the global economy is it has 1 billion people in the market. And their global economy needs that. That gives China leverage. And that's why the regional integration exercise, the collaboration exercise is so crucial. Because, and so for me, the big debate that has emerged on the African continent about creating African institutions, continental institutions, absolutely crucial. But they must become substantive institutions that create the space for a common set of rules and a common set of responsibilities. The second is collaboration in the South. And I think that's crucial because you can't reform the global order or reform the global economy without a collaboration in the South. Now, people say this is almost impossible. Well, we've just seen the most successful case of this in the World Trade negotiations. The first group of 20 was effectively a group of powers from the South who said to powers, political elites in both Europe and the United States, no deal, we're not making a deal. Let's break the negotiations and walk away from this. And it's one of the most powerful empowerment exercises, which is an example of the collaboration of the South. There's other multiple cases of this. In the South African context, you got this case of Brazil, IPSA, Brazil, India, and South Africa. We need to start rethinking that in strategic ways, not in some kind of procedural exercise, but a substantive exercise with a single agenda. And that's what the World Trade negotiations did. It brought a powerful agenda of collaboration under the table. So that's the second thing that I think is it. And the third is competition between international economic elites. Now, I mean, the reason I raise this is because just before this current crisis took off, if you looked at any journal on African politics, the big issue was China and how China is a problem because it's undermining democracy. Actually, the fact that China is a play is fantastic because suddenly the Europeans and the Americans and the Chinese are competing for African resources. And by competing, Africa suddenly got power. You can play them off against each other. For the first time, this is not a profoundly undemocratic, it's a profoundly democratic possibility because it creates the potential for development. You force competition between international, okay? And by that process, you've created the possibilities for leverage. So for me, what I want to pose onto the agenda is the governance dilemma is fundamentally not one of institutional design. It's one of the dilemma of power. And how do you create a configuration of power that allows for a double empowerment exercise? An empowerment of citizens against state elites and an empowerment of state elites against foreign actors. And it seems to me that, frankly, the policy literature, both by economists, but also the policy literature by governance experts, is profoundly missing on that front. It's about design. As if we're like fashion designers, we're doing things without looking at content. And that's the problem with this debate. And it seems to me that if we want to really take this issue, the only way we're going to do this is this double empowerment exercise that creates configurations of power that address the primary governance dilemma. And that then creates the potential for development. So I'll stop there. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much, Adam. So we've put a rich, I hope, menu of ideas before you in as provocative a manner as possible. We'll open up for discussion. We have about 40 minutes or so for discussion. I will take as many people as possible. Could I begin with Jimmy? We'll take everybody. Jimmy Additional, you are the first to raise your hand. Yes.
Just 2 quick points. I hope 2 quick points. I mean, look, we've been together for, 40 years. So it's almost like some form of telepathy going on. But one dimension of the question actually was what you raised about, which has been part of the narrative of the state. Huge, parastatals around it. Okay? Actually, if one goes beyond the kind of Paul Collier, what is the dragonfly floating on water but never actually stepping into the water, take the Nigerian context. The first two national development programs assumed that it would be foreign direct investment. It was supposed to be private-led. On both occasions, there was a failure of foreign investment. Fortuitously, in 1973, the oil thing came in, and the whole idea that the state can actually then lead, this whole idea about, and if you actually look at the investment, capital investment, all this nonsense about Dutch disease and this and that, if it's Dutch disease, what is it doing in Lagos? Okay? You will see take the Nigerian data and look at the investment and growth in industrial output, in capital investment, enormous, agriculture and things like that, okay? That's one dimension. And I think it's important to take that into consideration, not necessarily to assume. I think we should be open to a mix of policy options in terms of this development agenda. Not assume that because state did something wrong before, therefore it will do it wrong again. Nobody's putting cooperatives on the table. Okay? I mean, that's it. It's a fundamental dimension in terms of how people actually own and run their lives, and But there's a second dimension, is biographical. I was a civil servant. When I finished my first degree, I reluctantly went into the civil service. I was reluctant. But in the 2 years that I spent, I don't think I worked with people. The rule, first of all, to be an admin officer was supposed to be an elite thing. And you didn't see it. My salary was 135 naira, which would be, naira was 75 kobo was $1. So I probably was earning less than $200. But believe me, my mother came to our place one day and said, you guys are eating like kings. The money I saved took me through my master's year. And the civil service in which I worked, my permanent secretary got into trouble and had to resign because he violated the treasury rules about how, not embezzlement, okay? It was the rules in terms of procurement, that you needed 3, you can't be connected to any of the people involved, and it had to go through the Treasury Council, okay? And he missed one of them. And I know documents that I was involved in, development plan, and it was a passionate thing. I can't recognize this, rent-seeking, avaricious, something, not in the people I worked with. And I think this whole assumption that public servant, and it's happening in South Africa, and we are running into that, where politicians are assumed to be corrupt ab initio. That the whole idea that the people are driven by spirit of public service. Okay? And I don't think we should assume that this is not, you look at Singapore, you look at North Korea, we talk about dictatorship, but you cannot deny in Yerere, you can complain about Kaunda, but you can't doubt their passion. And I think it's about a new generation knowing that they had predecessors who were actually passionate about the development of the continent.
Thank you, Jimmy. Could I invite you, please, to also quickly mention your name, since a record is being kept for the ISSC. Josh.
I'm Josh Dewin from the Social Science Research Council in New York. My question is about the content or the meaning of democratic development state and the development part, and what do you envision as the role of the state? And Jimmy raised some of the questions. You mentioned parastatal organizations. He mentioned bringing in foreign investment and having mixed control over investment. There's no longer discussion of socialism or what a social approach to development might be in terms of the state role, and what particular relations there might be with local capital or with foreign capital that would allow for democratic control of development processes. So my question is more along the lines of what is the actual role of the state once it's democratized in terms of markets and in terms of social development or social control of development?
Samuel.
Yeah, thank you very much. I just want to pick up on Sam Moyo from Zimbabwe, African Institute for Agrarian Studies, also the current president of CODESRIA. The nice phrase that we heard yesterday was that it's not about, learning is not about imitation. But what was left out is that in practice in Africa, it's about imposition, okay? And I think that's the message, whether we're talking about in terms of social science, intellectual, ideological, and through the IFIs and so forth, the whole onslaught. I think that's the key issue. And just to go back to some of the questions that arise, I really feel passionately about the fact that we need to, when we talk about the vision of the state, there are the unaddressed questions that we were dealing with in the golden age, it turns out to be until the 70s, that were dropped during the structural adjustment from the 1980s. The agrarian question, this is an area that I work in, and all the elements, which included the kinds of state intervention, of course, they have to be adjusted, but we need a whole range of institutions, including parastatals and so forth, because the markets themselves became abusive and didn't work during this period. And today, just to keep on bashing Paul Collier, because he's a problem. One of the central suggestions is building on the neoliberal institutional reforms that have happened on property rights, to say concession out the whole land in Africa to agribusiness in the north, to take over the thing without addressing, criticizing the failure of the small farmers, peasants, and so forth, rather than criticizing the whole system of accumulation or de-accumulation that we have experienced. So agriculture is the main thing that we have to focus on. And we also have to focus on the property rights, not property rights as in freehold, land markets, no, to disempower people. In other words, how to empower, your question, Abib, about how to empower, is about creating the asset base and institutions that will protect production. That is the trade, intervene, and so forth. So even when we go to the regional level, we are talking about regionalism, a functionalist market type. This is ahistorical. It didn't happen in Europe. It didn't happen it's not happening anywhere. And the first thing we do is to liberalize all the rules of trade and the financial and all the kinds of things that you're talking about, doing that at the regional level, regionalizing into the global market against the development of structures of production locally. So the vision, we have to go back to the basics. That's the way I see it. Address the agrarian question, but obviously under new conditions globally. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Talking of concession, you will all remember the Madagascar case, where was it Daewoo, the multinational company, was actually given vast hectares by the government to grow food crop for re-export to Korea. And that was one of the triggers for the conflict that resulted in the fall of the government of Mark Ravalomanana. Yeah, Bob Deakin.
Okay, Bob Deakin, Professor of International Social Policy in the UK and Director of a Programme on Globalisation and Social Policy. These three papers added together followed brilliantly one upon the other, and I don't dissent from almost anything that was said. My own work has been on the question of the impact of structural adjustment on social policy and the capacity to deliver social policy in Africa and elsewhere, and have come to the same conclusion, that we have eroded the state's capacity to deliver, and we've ended up with the global politics of poverty alleviation rather than what I prefer to see as the global politics of welfare state rebuilding. I also agree with the conclusion on regionalism. I've just edited a book on world regional social policy in Latin America, Africa, and South Asia, which draws the conclusion that this is precisely what was argued for, an empowering possibility for regions to then challenge the EU's attempt to drive its economic priority areas through Africa. Having said all that, that gives me the right, I hope, to say I have a problem, all right? And the problem is you may now regard as really not important at all, right? And the problem is, what do progressives in the global north do to contribute to this new renewal of a African-driven rebuilding of the state in the way that you've described it, right? In the architecture of aid, historically, has contributed to the problems that you've been describing. Yeah? Aid has empowered NGOs, paid people in NGOs bigger salaries, pulled them out of the state, has contributed to the problem that you've described, right? So the aid process of the past, we don't want to see replicated. And we don't want to see the Collier idea, yeah, of a sort of flying in of technocrats to provide services. The issue is this. Is there any alliance that can be constructed between progressives in the global north and the global south on this question? My own government has decided that 20% of its ODA shall now flow into the budgets of governments in Africa to provide health and education services of a universal kind. Now, is that welcome or not? Yeah? Is there a role or not for north-south transfers for overseas development geared at contributing to the development of democratic welfare states in Africa? I ask this because I had a confrontation with Josh Tandon from Focus Web on the Global South recently in the Geneva Centre. When I was arguing, he said, we don't want aid, we're out from under aid, we want to do it by ourselves, we're part of history, yeah? So that's the question. Are progressives in the global north trying to get more money from the north to the south into governments, part of history, and we should just shut up shop? Or is there still a dialogue to be had in terms of that question?
Okay, thank you, Bob Deakin. Okay, Peter. Yes.
Thanks, Peter Ratting from UN Research Institute for Social Development. Well, it's a shame, I think we lost the regional comparative perspective here, because one thing I've been trying to do is get a sense of why the African story is different to, say, the Latin American story. And what comes out of the Latin American story is very much this idea of imposition from the outside. Now, I think in Latin America, there was a phase when that was very much the story. But then as the analysis looked at how liberalism gets embedded locally. So we had the rise of all sorts of interests which are promoting the liberalism agenda from within. And I'm just wondering why this doesn't sort of come out in the context of Africa. So we have the rise of technocracies that believe in this. We have the rise of, obviously, class interests that benefit from this. We have the whole NGO phenomenon, which are not developing the same critique that we have, etc. And so there are internal interests which are pushing this. And I just wonder whether, even if the World Bank now recognizes that its policies may have failed, and but Bayo suggested it may be trying to change track a bit, whether the orthodoxy will continue, partly because of those internal interests.
Thank you very much. Yes.
Yeah, I'm Gonzalo Abad. I'm from Latin America. I'm from Ecuador. And I'd like to rebound on just what Peter has said. In the cases of the reforms that are taking place in the spring of Latin America, we call it now, one thing is very important in what you said about the state, and that is that in the three cases, Bolivia, Ecuador, and Venezuela, you will find that the movement has been launched at the political level, not as an economic discussion. So the point is that it's the social movements who have been able to pursue this progressive tendency. And a point there is that the political parties have been put aside from this movement. So in the three cases, you might find some political parties, but the traditional political parties, where there are liberal, conservatives, and so forth, are out of the scenery now. So that's what we call a citizens' revolution. In other words, it's a differentiation from the conception of a democracy where you have the three powers and we have political parties as intermediaries. You have now an intention of construction of another type of relationship between the state and the citizens. In the case of Ecuador, for instance, there has been a fourth function of power being created, which is called the citizens' power control situation. And that is going to be done on universal elections level, so that you have a participation of the social movement in the decision-making of the new state in the new constitution. So there is a new conception of how the state has to be done. And to do that, it has to be done through, it had to be done through the political regime. In other words, it's the political regime which is questioned. That's one point. The second point is on the role of the state. One of the consequences of neoliberalism during 15 years has been the ineptitude of the state to manage. Because technocrats have come, of course, well, you know the whole story. But the thing is, what they have is reduced the capacity of the state to deliver. So one of the main challenges we have now is to reconstruct a state that delivers. And that is not that easy. You need political support to do that. So that's why I think it's on the political sense that the movement has been, or the progressive movement has been attached. A second point on what just Peter said, and on aid. I don't think anybody is going to reject the aid. And I'm very glad to hear that the UK is going to give 20% free financing for education, health, and so forth. The point is that what we want is us to decide what the aid is for. So that's the point. So there's a change in the demand we're going to put to aid. And in the three countries, at least Bolivia, Ecuador, and Venezuela, we don't want to argue with the International Monetary Fund or with the World Bank. We want to find out other ways of financing. And that I come to the regional integration point, which is absolutely important. So that's why we are building UNASUR, which is the new regional setup, where one of the main points is the Southern Bank, from where the decisions we are going to take are for our own good.
Thank you very much. Pierre Sané.
Thank you, Pierre Sané from UNESCO. Three brief questions, one to each of the speakers. The first one to Adam on your double empowerment process. My question is, what happens if the two processes are not connected? Because you say that you need to empower the state vis-à-vis the rest of the world, and in order to do that, you develop alliances at the regional level, alliances in the south, and you put international economic actors in competition. What happens if you have not worked on your first level of empowerment, which is, so you have a state that is empowered against external actors, and you have citizens who are not empowered. Because it seems to me that the best way to empower the state is to ensure that the citizens are empowered, and therefore that the state is accountable first and foremost to its citizens. The second question, you have moved from vice to virtue. That is the first depiction of how the African state was perceived by international financial institutions, and what led to the reform was that it was all greed. And now you have moved to a situation where greed somehow has disappeared. It's as if all the political leaders in Africa suddenly have become virtuous, and then all civil servants are just driven by passion and by yes. So we know that greed is still there, like it is everywhere else. It is universal. The question is how you put a check on that greed so that it doesn't destroy a fragile development process, which brings us to the rule of law and accountability. And then to Bio, I was not here when you started. I just wanted to make sure that you talked about, whether you talked about the Lagos Plan of Action and the Berg Report, because that is where it all started. You mentioned that. Yeah. Okay, then that's fine.
Thank you very much. Yes, colleague from Ethiopia, Addis Ababa University.
I'm just wondering, are they able to collect all these questions?
It's being recorded.
Okay. You know, this issue of development is not even a matter of academic thinking. It's a matter of daily life, and it's a matter of finding ways to lift people around you out of poverty, out of a very sad way of living. So it is very close to our heart. That's why you see people very excited about it, and you know, in a way, pleasantly charged. I want you to think of that at the back of your mind. My question was, if the idea of a democratic developmentalist state is a workable solution, a plausible solution for a way ahead, one, a state which is accountable, as you said, first and foremost to its citizens, and then to international, to regional powers, to make sure that it is empowered against international actors. The task, as you put it, would be a double empowerment, and you are repeatedly asking a question, how do we empower? And the question I was asking myself down there was, who are we? Who should take this prime responsibility of making sure that a superstructure, a state, an institution that we call governments, are to be accountable, and citizens are strong enough, collectively, not in a disenfranchised, very weak way, to be able to stand out and ask and account their governments. It just baffles me. It just makes me wonder, where would that equation work out? And this is not to be elitist, and this is not to find out a certain category of population saying, you know, if they do it, then everything else would follow. But yet again, I would like to emphasize that leadership is important. The notion of leadership is important. And I would like also for you, gentlemen, to reflect on the notion of the intelligentsia. Where do African intellectuals, where do intellectuals in the South, not just Africa, stand in this huge challenge, in this tall order of ensuring empowerment of citizens, but also empowering the states against the North? Thanks.
Yes, thank you very much. I think we'll take the last set of interventions. Yes, Zach Williams and Dr. Sanaseku.
Hi, my name is Alfred Zach Williams, University of Central Lancashire, and immediate past president of the African Studies Association of the UK. I decided to speak because Bob has spoken, and Bob, you might not remember me, last time we were in the same room was when he held a conference on socialist social policy way back in his university in Leeds. But the first thing I want to say is that when we had a conference last summer, the African Studies Association, it was interesting that my presidential address and the plenary address, it's unusual for the African Studies Association to have a plenary address, but we invited Fantu Cheru to give a talk. And we had no collaboration, but the issues we dealt with is exactly what you guys have spoken about. Yes, exactly the issues about the democratic developmental state. And the point was made that there is no way out for Africa without a developmental state, democratic developmental state. We're not saying to go back to the state of the 60s and 80s. You know, again, as I hear we talk about greed, particularly the way Dio really gave that dichotomy about the way the IFI sees governance. In the case of Africa, it's all about greed. Well, you know, I'm from Britain. I've been in Britain since my teenage. You won't believe this, but and recently, if you read the British papers, you will see what our MPs are doing. I don't know if you're reading the papers. You talk about greed. Some are even claiming for underpants of their wives. Yes, some claiming for pornographic things they're watching on TV. Yes. So when we talk about greed, it's important to make that point absolutely clear. Yeah, because the reason I say this, what I haven't heard, I want to know what's the difference between the current crisis of central capitalism and the crisis that Africa went through in the 70s and 80s that led to structural adjustment. Because if you look, the policy that is being implemented now in Britain and the US is exactly the opposite. Yes? They're now taking our money, giving them to banks. Yeah. Yes? Whilst they told us, you must privatize your banks, the ones that are profitable, you privatize, and the ones that are not, you liquidate. Yes? So you're absolutely right in pointing to the destructive effect. And Ralph talked about the Sierra Leone Railway. Fantastic. That marked the end of development in Sierra Leone. The moment they decided to sell the railway, farmers could not bring their produce because they did not construct good roads for the goods to come to the market. Yes? And I'll just end with one point. I mean, I said Bob because Bob made that point. What can we, well, you know, northern comrades do? Yes? I tell you what happened. I was sitting in my office and I got a call from the Foreign and Commonwealth Office. We're having a seminar on Sierra Leone. Would you be interested? I said, what is it about? It's about governance. You see, as the chiefs, as the war is ending, the people are coming back. We're building houses for the chiefs. And I shouted. I said, what? You building houses for chiefs? I said, are you aware that these people were part of the problems of the first military intervention in Sierra Leone? Oh, no, well, no one has ever said this to us. That's why we want you down here. Yes. So I said to them, so what are you trying to do? Are you trying to modernize feudalism? I said, what about the people? I thought you would build clinics. I thought that's where I would start. But you know, the reason I'm making this is the way those of us who have voices in the North, these are the things that we need to draw attention to. Yeah. I just ended that.
Thank you. Thank you, Zach. Mr. Samaseku.
Thank you so much. I'll try to speak in English. I don't know if my thoughts will come through, but I have one comment and one question. The comment is, first of all, thank you very much for this powerful presentations, these powerful presentations. But I was thinking, why do we have the theme only for the South? Why don't we manage to question governance and development in the North? And what you said right now was the issue of the crisis today. What kind of development are we talking about? This development in the North has led us to the situation where we are today. What I call the culture of having has led all the world in a failure. I think it's important for the researchers from South and maybe from North, the progressives, to work together to see how we can describe the issues of governance and multinationals in the North. So we are in a World Social Forum. Why are we always going to stick the words of governance and development for only the South? For me, development is the process of mastering the environment, both in the South, in the North, in the West, in the East. So for the researchers, I think this is a point. This is a comment from my humble point of view. The second thing is a question. Adam Habib, I was very delighted by your presentation. But how do you empower citizens in countries where, in fact, 85 to 90% of the citizens don't master the languages in which all the issues of governance and politics are shared by the elite? How can you, in fact, make of our peasants, our workers everywhere, be part of the discussions, be part of the decision-making process when they don't understand what is going on because they are not aware. This is the question, but your second point is excellent. But it is what Africa is trying to do today, to really, and also, of course, the Venezuela, Bolivia, and Ecuador. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Puleng. I apologize to the panelists, but it's, I think, also useful to allow a proper discussion.
Thank you very much for your wonderful presentation. My questions are directed to all of you, but I would like to start with you, Adam. I think your notion that there must be empowerment, at least at a regional level, is very important. But I was just wondering, thinking about the economic partnership negotiations and the strategy of bypassing the collaboration by regions to resorting to bilateral agreements. I'm wondering, how do we think of that empowerment, given that the praxis by multilateral institutions or even governments of the North, when they really want the European Union, for example, in those negotiations, resorted to that sense of division where the coherent collaboration was fragmented. And it seemed to me that if we think of that regional empowerment, we might also want to think in the light of these practical, realistic experiences that we have just recently heard. The second question that I wanted to address is I understand the importance of empowering states. I think it's necessary. I understand the importance of propelling the human and moral agency of citizens in their own development. But I also see a disconnect in the sense that there are other players that have become very powerful, such as corporate sector, in its transnational, multinational, even local expressions. And I have wondered, when academic scholarship concentrates on the state and on the citizens, and yet some of the major players who are impacting on the lives of citizens and of states and the diminution of the state with the experience of SAPS, how do we address some of those issues? The last issue is just a response from the colleague who was talking about alliances with the North and what do we do with aid. The whole issues of ecological debt as the responsibility of northern countries that have benefited from the plunder or exploitation of Africa through colonialism, and so puts the responsibility, whether it's redistributive or rectificatory justice, it is essential that academic responsibility by northerners also take into consideration that the exploitation of Africa, whether through colonialism or economic globalization and its excesses, or the collapse or crisis of the economy as we're experiencing currently, is something that has to be constantly discussed, because it's presented as though aid is the panacea for the problems in Africa, yet aid is also sometimes the perpetual or the ongoing legacies of colonialism and the crisis that we've had, at least in the context of Africa. And I was going to ask you, what about women?
They are central to the developmental democratic states.
In what ways?
Raufu will tell us what ways. Okay, yes. I really have to bring this to a close, and I thank you for the enthusiastic. We have the sponsor of the panel, Ibrahima Sal, Kodesrea. There's a lady at the back, right? And there's the colleague who has been really very patient. Yeah, so we'll close it at that.
Thank you.
If you make it very brief at this point.
He is the sponsor of the panel. I work for Kodesrea, of course, Ibrahim Sal. I actually wanted to make just a very small comment listening to what Alfred was saying about greed. I think this actually, it is important that we remind ourselves that really, what is politics about if it is not to manage the passions and put a check on some of these things? I think Pierre made the point. So it's really, in a way, a depoliticization of the issues by letting everybody believe that what is going on in Africa is not about politics. It's about personal interests and people wanting to take more than their share. But that is what politics have been about forever, right? The second thing I wanted to say is, I think it was very clear from what Bayo was saying, and Rauf too, that we've been debating these issues. We've been making the arguments. But maybe it tells us something also in the way the global politics of knowledge works, that why is it so difficult for Africans to have their voices heard, right? Why has it been so difficult for it to be recognized that actually these points have been made before, right? And it will take a Stiglitz or somebody else to come and say the same things we've been saying before they become issues on the agenda today. I think there's something here maybe we'd like to interrogate. Finally, I thought the point that Adam made, the reference to the Scandinavian model was very, very important. I thought that was maybe the comparative dimension that somebody referred to. I think that I thought was very, very important to bring into this panel. Unfortunately, the attempt to bring Harry and other people on board didn't work. But yeah, I thought I wanted just to make those points. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Yes, the lady from, I think, the Sudan. Yeah.
So, thank you, and Naim Busaina from Sudan, Juba University. Actually, I also am totally Juba University, yes. I have a question, or actually illustration from you, to hear something from you all, and specifically from Mr. Habib, about the empowerment of citizens and the empowerment of the elites and the empowerment of the state. You see, although I'm a scientist in the sense of I'm academic, but also I'm a civil society activist, you see, and I'm advocating a lot. And now in Sudan, although there is a lot of problems, but we are in a transitional period, in the sense of this is democratic development is very important for us now. And we have 7 months, which we have to work as, for me, especially with a lot of group of civil society organizations and civil society activists, also as a scientist, in the way of how can we empower the citizen, or voter education and the election, how it can come, and all the democratic transformation it could be. Because we have this the peace agreement between the Southern Sudan and Northern Sudan, although we have still the problem of Darfur is there, but there is, okay, negotiation. And so the thing is that I'm hearing a theoretical thing. I want something that I can touch and then I can realize, you see. I want something that is maybe guidelines that could help me as activist in how can I realize these theoretical thoughts, you see. How can I bring it in reality, and how can I go from now, for example, and I have in mind I have to do so and so and so and so and so till these 7 months. We have, our election is in February next year. Okay, and then we are working, we have a coalition of civil society organizations, we have a lot of actually movements now. So I'm sorry for maybe, but just I need to hear something that could guide me to how can I realize what you have seen. Thank you.
Thank you very much. A blueprint.
Thank you. Charlie Gabriel Mbok, most UNESCO program. As quickly as possible, Mr. Chair. I'm getting the answer to my concern as for the social dimension of social sciences. I raised the point this morning, but I did not really get the answer. disconnection has created discontent in our country. And maybe we should keep in mind that many African countries have been colonized. Some may not yet be colonies, but many may be neo-colonies. We cannot expect the Prime Minister of Britain. I am coming from a country which is supposed to be bilingual. We speak French and English as official languages. We experienced the German colonization, the British colonization, and the French colonization. And we cannot expect Gordon Brown and the Prime Minister of France to fight the top of Mount Cameroon because there are some people down there who pretend to be Francophones or Anglophones. But when it comes to money, they call the IMF and the World Bank to squeeze money from the country. This is the structural adjustment plan. Nobody worries whether they are interfering into any sovereignty at all. But now when it comes to elections, when it comes to reconnecting the people to the state, nobody will call any organization in the world. They will say we should not interfere into internal policy. My point is there, since the IMF and the World Bank are money hunting, is there any organization in the world which we can refer to in order to promote a democratic adjustment plan to help reconnect the people to the state? It can help build up the democratic developmental state we need. It's just a matter of dreaming, but I believe we can make it if we take into account all that we have been learning here this afternoon. Thank you indeed for the job well done.
Thank you. Thank you very much indeed. May I invite Raufu to take any of the issues, some of them are connected, that you feel strongly, okay, the very, 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 very last one. After all, it's about governance.
Thank you for allowing me to be the very, very, very last one. My name is Dag Ingebø from the University of Bergen, and I have a question considering empowerment. And you could say that the power resulting from the empowerment you're referring to is the power needed for a clash of interests, yeah? Whereas you could say as this power is a tool, or rather a weapon in a political trench warfare. And in this context, at the international world stage, you could say that power could be thought of like energy. It cannot be created, it can only change form. Like as you referred to with both the G20 meeting and with China intervening in Africa. And also as it was referred to here by the former speaker by mentioning the colonial powers, and then you had the transfer of power into the independency, and then the retransfer of power through the SAP, which indeed could be called a recolonization. And I was asking, what power do you intend to remove in order for the re-empowering of Africa? According to a philosopher, Vladimir Lenin, there is an absolute connection between power and welfare. And the power that has been transferred away from Africa is, as you referred to, ended up somehow in places like Washington and embedded in the structure of capitalism. And it makes me raise first one question. What good has capitalism done for Africa, if you think of it in the large picture? And the imminent question after that is, what good will capitalism do for Africa, do you really think? Thank you.
Thank you, comrade. Well,
I think as the questions flowed, I became somewhat alarmed that I may have communicated something that is not entirely what I had in mind. I'm not suggesting that we replace, and this question from Sudan just concretized all of it for me. I'm not advocating replacing one orthodoxy with another. There is no blueprint. We want to be able to experiment in terms of our own abilities and desires. That's all I ask. And that will mean that, of course, both intellectually and practically, people go in different directions. And so long as it's socially justifiable, yeah, they should be entitled to do so. And that will necessarily mean those who want to try socialism by Chavez style, good luck to them. The issue now is that even reasonable things are blocked and replaced with something that is not working. And instead what you get is the multitude of kind of supine suggestions, which are nothing but, has no history of who contributed to what, so no sense of responsibility. In my view, that's only an assertion of power. You have nothing, I will talk and you have to listen. That's the impression I get from some of the debate. That's the power we want to get rid of. We want the power for people to be able to experiment. Some of it will be good, some will not be so. Hopefully there's accountability. People who willfully impose damage on their society will be brought to book according to the values. So that will be my own model. So having said that, unfortunately for Sudan, I have no model whatsoever. Nothing to suggest other than to encourage you, as you are doing, that you owe a responsibility as a citizen to get involved in whatever way. And I think this connects also with the issue of leadership and intellectuals. If I understand Adam well, Adam is saying that that particular understanding of leadership as technocratic leadership, you need economists to crunch numbers and sit in Washington and tell you what to do. No, that's not the leadership we want. We need leadership that will engage in that process of finding out an informed choice, socially embedded. So leadership in this sense, yes. In the technocratic sense, no. And this necessarily means that intellectuals have a role to play to elaborate the implications of the different options. I wasn't suggesting that African politicians have been cast from vice to virtue. I come from Nigeria and I'll be foolish to make such a statement, even in my sleep. But what I suggest is that the criteria for vice and the criteria for virtue has to be socially relevant, not economically driven and more imposed by the morality of an external group. And I'll take a small example. Nigeria may be many things. If you take all the big states in Africa, Nigeria has done better than Sudan, better than the DRC. There is no possibility that Nigeria will implode in the way those countries have imploded. There is also no possibility that a rascal in West Africa will go about what's happening in Sudan, Somalia, and Nigeria will not allow it. These are all issues of statecraft in which money has been invested, lives have been invested, because the Nigerian elite, never mind all their faults, have a certain vision which they are carrying out. I'm myself a product of an educational system in which schools were deliberately built in far-flung corners of the country, and resources were meant to pick people and throw them in parts that they didn't belong to. From the World Bank's point of view, that's economically rational. But from the Nigerian state building point of view, that was really what we needed to understand each other and to be able to at least build an infrastructure of our coherence. So I'm not suggesting there are thieves, but there are also people whose logic is not strictly economic in the World Bank sense. So vice becomes difficult to define in that kind of moral, anything you do is corrupt agenda that we get. We open it up, and then we can see those who genuinely are throwing money at a problem the best way they can, and those who are trying to steal. With some luck, hopefully we'll be able to define the distinction between vice and virtue in this experimental way. And the critical thing, of course, is the question of accountability, which should also be internal. What is also interesting about the so-called virtue of the governance thing is that it doesn't work. In reality, if you look at all the anti-corruption agencies on the continent, yeah, they're a bloody shame, a moral shame on those who are. I mean, people put their lives at risk. The guy in Nigeria who tried to fight corruption, Ribadu, he's in my college. That guy has done for that country things, if I live for 100 years, I will not be able to do. But it's all wasted. The crooks are back in charge. So even the so-called virtues of the bank is not working. And I think this is the kind of the criteria, the actors, the ways of judging vice and virtue needs to be also opened up. I agree that our whole experience in the past 2 decades, there are technocracies in Africa, NGOs, think tanks that are bought into this system. But by and large, they are quite marginal. The most important case where you find this technocracy important is Ghana. And if you look at the studies of the PRSP process in Ghana and the think tanks, what is important is that they say we have to open up this dialogue to societal input. And then they say, you, and you, come to the table, which seems to me to defeat the purpose. This was supposed to be to society, not you handing over your so-called responsibility to selected people who you fund, who will not necessarily contradict you. So yes, there may be technocracies and NGOs. I don't think that they've changed the problem we are raising in any fundamental way. The challenge still remains that many of those young men who end up in NGOs, if you find jobs for them, if you try to rebuild the state, in my state also, I'm sorry I keep going back to my Nigerian experience, because it best captures it. They administered an exam to secondary school teachers, an exam which they gave to their own students, and only 10% of the teachers passed. And now what they are doing, they are going to recruit people to retrain the teachers. So in the process of engaging with your problem, you create jobs, but you create the kind of jobs you need. Not the sense in which sometimes some of the students I teach about Nigeria, the next time they call me, I'm in the Ministry of Finance in Abuja. I have this problem, can you help? They have so much responsibility and so little knowledge. But they are there because they are linked up with the systems of global, if you like, control. So tackling the technocracies and the NGO will also be, in a sense, creating alternatives for our youth and taking them into a much more, maybe I just answer one or two more. The issue about what's the role of the state in social development is very multiple. We'll leave it open. Different societies will pick up on different things. But the 4 basic things are those: there has to be a vision, there has to be coordination, and you have to manage conflict. And you have to build institutions to kind of embed all of that. But the exact mix and the exact policy framework, I think, will differ from place to place. And I hope also that we don't see this thing as a peculiarly African problem. And here I'm addressing the issue of what does the progressive North do. I think we should separate the issue of responsibility from the issue of aid. Responsibility, I think what's happening in Africa has implications for you everywhere in the world, really, even if you don't see it. Many people say, if Nigeria collapses, West Africa is gone. Basic, it's just as simple. Anything from Cameroon to Senegal will be converted into a wasteland. And there are over 2 million Nigerians in the US, over 1 million Nigerians in Britain. There will be knock-on effect on all of these societies. And we haven't even come to those who use the internet for all manner of things, sitting in Lagos and working away at it. So we can't afford any part of the world to collapse, in my view. It's a moral responsibility. We were discussing issues of poverty as human rights earlier this afternoon. It's not just, we are not being benevolent to the poor. We are protecting ourselves from the consequence of having a poor neighbor and what they can do. So the global north has responsibilities to what's happening in Africa because it's in the interest of the global north, particularly of the progressive elements within them. I think this can be removed from the issue of aid. And here I think we can have somewhat of a divergent opinion in terms of actually what's happening now and what can possibly be done. I support the idea of putting aid through the government budget. You hold them accountable for the money they are given, rather than give some NGOs to go and undermine what's going on. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Rauf. Adam?
Okay. It's a hell of a lot, but I'm going to be very quick. You'll notice that I never spoke much about policy. And what I did speak about was power. Because it seems to me that actually there's been a fantastic debate upon policy. Ibrahim is right. The ideas, a fair degree of ideas are already there. Actually, why African voices haven't been heard is because African voices don't have power. If you can reconfigure power, those voices get to be heard. And those ideas flow. And that's the way I think the governance dilemma lies. And so for me, that was the first issue. But if you're looking for quite quick examples, I can't imagine the African development state not doing certain things. And I think if you simply look in parts of the developing world, you will see part of those responsibilities. Let me give you quick examples of that. The first is, I can't imagine key public goods not being performed by parastatals. Major transport, electricity, in some levels telephony, but water, all of those kinds of things. That's the first. Second, the agrarian question in the African God has to be addressed. I think it has to be addressed. It's been raised here. And that agrarian question has to have two elements. It's the democratization of land and the democratization of agricultural production. You don't have those two elements, you just won't create the systemic effects for that. So I think that that's the second thing that it has to do. The third, you have to drive on employment in places like South Africa. And if you're going to drive employment, you can't do it without industrial targeting. You have to start driving into that, and with tariff reforms. No way in the world has it happened where you drove employment without industrial targeting and tariff reforms. I think fourth is mobilization of domestic capital. No single development in the world has happened without the mobilization of domestic capital, including China, by the way. The majority of capital mobilized in China is domestic. It is not international. This is the myth that has come out. So I think that there's certain basic principles, and I think it seems to me that those are the defining characteristics of this democratic development state. There's obviously a mix of policy reforms that will flow, tariffs. And for me, I'm not ideological about this. I'm not frankly religious about this. It depends what kind of tariffs. It depends whether those tariffs are going to drive employment or not. If you ask me to put tariffs on nuclear weapon technology, bugger it. You want to put tariffs on certain things that drive labor employment? Absolutely. Let's not become religious about these things. So it's a much more pragmatic approach. On the question of progressives in the North, I must say there's three things for me which I do want to put on the agenda. The first is there's a kind of false debate of aid or trade. And particularly it's emerged from some quarters in South Africa as well. If you look at every successful case, South Korea, Taiwan, Singapore, Western Europe, all of that, it's a combination of aid and trade. Japan had $500 million per annum between 1950 and 1970. South Korea had $13 billion. Taiwan had $5 billion, all from the states alone. But combined with that, what was most powerful in all of those cases wasn't aid. It was the combination of aid and preferential trade engagements with the United States. What we've had in the last couple of years is some aid and closing down of trade rules. You can't have, it's a complex mix between the two. So the first thing is to open up that debate by progressives. You want to open up a debate? Well, let's have a serious conversation with different on those kinds of questions. The terms of aid and how do you combine aid and trade. The second, I do think we need to break the North-South divide. The only way you're going to enhance the position of the South is if the North is divided. And so you've got to start engaging Europe in a way that is different from this. You need to start creating tensions and contestations within the Western alliance, by breaking China and this thing. And you need to start playing. How do you engage Germany against the US? Those kinds of complex debates, I don't think we've engaged with sufficiently in the South, and I think we need to start doing that. And the third is what I call, what for progressives, is deal with systemic hypocrisy. And I'll tell you where there's two examples of systemic hypocrisy in the current world. This thing. Zimbabwe is a fantastic case. The big issue of Zimbabwe is an issue of both the rights of citizens, which I think is important, but also land and the inequality of land ownership and how that has created the problems. The debate, if you see from international courts, is one and not the other. You cannot understand the resolution of the Zimbabwean question. Let me give you another example, highly controversial again, Iran. Everybody talks, stop the Iranians from getting the bomb. But no one is saying the bloody Brits are modernizing the entire nuclear submarine fleet. That every major major nuclear power that signed the NPT has violated the NPT by testing weapons, the US, China, France, and Britain. Nuclear weapons. It's a profound hypocrisy. Progressives have to put that in there. If you look at the debate that is coming out from the human rights community, it raises the one issue, it doesn't raise the other. And so it seems to me there's a profound hypocrisy here, and what it's created is a false divide between the struggles for nationalism and the struggles of liberalism. And unless we bridge that divide, we are in. So I wanted to put that on the agenda. Pierre, on the issue, if you don't get the empowerment of citizens, but you get the empowerment of state, you get skewed development. The classic case is Saudi Arabia. Go to Saudi Arabia, you see how you get development in favor of elites. And so that's the kind of thing that we need to this thing. How to empower? Well, I mean, you're right. I think this is where and it seems to me that here the answer is context. You have to understand context, because in different societies, the actual mechanisms of empowerment might change. But I've just done a piece on South Africa that looked at what you would look. And there's a couple of things that I've raised. For me, in South Africa, viable opposition parties is crucial. Because it's not about the good guys or the bad guys. It's about how do you create the systemic pressures. Development that happens with viable opposition parties. So that's the first. Electoral reform, I argued, was important. Because what electoral reform does is it forces MPs to become answerable to citizens directly. Social mobilization in the South African context is absolutely crucial. Social movements, that is there. Fourth, I argue against compacts between labor and capital. Because compacts in power, in arenas of disempowerment lead to co-option. And often that is something that is not considered. Somebody raised the issue of the intelligentsia. For me, if you have embedded universities, then autonomy becomes important. So context is important. They might differ in precise cases, but I can give you 100 examples in the South African context. One of the issues that should be in the South African context that hasn't been addressed is the issue of language. Because one of the most powerful disempowerment exercises when 70 or 80% of the citizens can't speak the legal language, the political language, and the language of education. And that is there. And then the final thing that I will say, which I think is the real issue, on the issue of bilateral agreement, I think they're very dangerous. That is why I think a regional agreement is absolutely crucial. And that requires two things. It requires political leadership, but it also requires regional leadership by some countries to provide regional goods, even at their own expense. And one of the things that I've been arguing in South Africa, on the African continent, South Africa should be obliged to provide certain regional goods, even at the cost of their own domestic interests, because it provides a broader context for the development of this thing. And finally, the question on energy, power being like energy, absolutely. Where is power going to move from? In part, the empowerment of citizens and the empowerment of the African state does require the disempowerment of international political elites and MNCs. And I don't think we should hide from that fact. That is something that we require. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Adam. I will not abuse your patience much more by attempting to answer any question that remains unanswered, except to say that even on matters of language, we can extend the debate a bit further in understanding that recent economic governance language has also been crafted in a way to disempower. So you don't call an object by its name. You've looked for all kinds of funny, what was it now? Quantitative easing. Right? Bank of England, quantitative easing. It's printing of money. Right? You don't say you are withdrawing subsidies. You say you are doing user charges. And the person in Zimbabwe who is told that user charges will now start so that you pay according to what you use. Some people use more, some people use less, is celebrating that, yeah, user charges are good, until you then experience it that it actually means that you are going to pay more for everybody is paying more in one way or the other. And all of those things that we saw in the 80s and 90s across the continent, that really means that the whole business of governance, particularly of economic governance, became a domain of domination and of a certain, even dull compulsion of the lower classes. The technocratic model of Latin America, actually in many ways, there's an account which we once gave in the 80s, that the adjustment model that was applied in Africa was based on a reading of the Latin American crisis. It was not based on a reading of the African crisis. And almost everything else that has been tried out in Latin America, especially, has been tried out in Africa. So the political economy literature of the late 80s, early 90s, Steph Haggard and others, actually pointed out to the role of technocrats, right, in successful adjustment. So people like Ernesto Zedillo, Carlos Salinas de Gortari, the guy in Menem in Argentina, were all celebrated. They were Ivy League for the fact of going to Princeton. He, of course, then went back home and pursued sensible economic policies, and Argentina started to transform. The finance minister was a Yale guy. Another one was from Harvard. It became a competition of Ivy Leagues to try to project the role of technocrats in successful reform. And that was transformed into the context in Africa also. The World Bank, on the one hand, created the Economic Research Consortium in Nairobi. Paul Collier and co are faculty at that consortium, producing little colliers who will be, black colliers who you cannot attack on account of and then you had the capture of the central banks and the finance ministries. And a lot of the central banks in Africa today are run by people either seconded from Washington or who have been in the World Bank networks, almost without exception. The most recent case of Tanzania, Beno Ndulu left the policy unit in Washington to take over the Bank of Tanzania. Take the Bank of Kenya, take even the Central Bank of Nigeria. All of those connections are there. So there's a deliberate attempt to try to manufacture a technocracy that will not be easily attacked or undermined or even delegitimated on account of being foreign. They are as indigenous as the rest of us. And that, of course, changes the terms of the discussion and the debate, because then the ways in which to respond to them, fortunately made easy for the opposition by the fact that those policies simply are not working and they don't have any local anchorage. There are no local bearers beyond the technocrats themselves who find themselves having to resort to authoritarian methods. The interim prime minister of Niger, before the transition was completed, was seconded from the World Bank. When the National Conference of Niger said that it had had enough of structural adjustment and that anything else but that IMF World Bank program, he thought his mission in Niger as prime minister, interim prime minister, was to ensure that the National Conference both proclaimed democracy and structural adjustments at the same time. And went to argue with them, disagree with them and everything, and he was overruled. And finally, he resigned in protest to go back to his job in Washington. And that's why Niger will never develop. You can see the kind of, the politics of this technocracy is essentially one that is completely anti-democratic. I think perhaps why we insist on a democratic developmental state is precisely to underscore the point not only in terms of the economic policy heterodoxy that is necessary. Developmental states that are democratic, by definition, will have policy processes and institutions that are open to contestation and to input and participation. And out of that process, you are not going to be enslaved by orthodoxies of the kinds that we saw over the last 2.5 decades across the African continent. So policy orthodoxy as an integral part of the democratic developmental model, but also important because the usurpation of power and of privilege, which the technocracy tried to get away with in the course of the late 90s into the new millennium, will also be avoided. Governments will be held accountable. The creation of executive agencies of government became the third phase, actually, of the public sector reforms, in which you, across the continent of Africa, executive agencies were being established and given exclusive, taken out of public service rules, and given all kinds of powers to carry out policy and taxation and whatever. How is that different from what Paul Collier is suggesting today, to have a super agency with a board of directors made up of donors and acceptable technocrats locally? They are the kinds of things which actually don't help us to advance the goal of recovering the agenda of development on the African continent. And I think it's important for us to keep that in mind. Technocracy will have its place, but it will have to be disciplined to politics. What the Latin Americans did at the end of that first phase of the late 80s and 1990s was, I think, something that the studies sponsored by UNRIST brought out, the technopoles, the technocrats who decided to become politicians and to carry their case to, to the electorate in a context where the integrity of the electoral process was also becoming increasingly clear. Now, that technopolic elite had its day in Brazil, had its day in Argentina, had its day elsewhere, has exhausted its possibilities. The pendulum has swung in favor of social movements that are now driving politics in Venezuela, in Ecuador, in other places that we see are undergoing some fairly profound changes. I think there's room for us to undertake extensive comparative research, comparative work looking at Africa, Asia, and Latin America. I strongly support the idea of the South-South collaborative frames and the lessons we can learn from one another. The regionalist context, which also enables us, Asia has been talking since the East Asian crisis of an East Asian monetary fund, similar to what Hugo Chavez is proposing for Latin America, and we may well have to move in that direction also on the African continent. It is, of course, a tale of two adjustments. I'm working on a paper presently in which I am looking at the language of adjustment, the content of adjustment policy, and the politics of adjustment processes, looking at the current crisis arising from the so-called subprime / financial meltdown in the West. How is the West adjusting with the structural adjustment that we underwent in the 80s? And you'll find that the language is, even at the level of language, is completely different. And I think it's important that we bring out these contradictions in order also to weaken the legitimacy. It's, of course, a matter for concern that out of all of the efforts at stimulus that we have seen, the stimulus that affects us has been given to the IMF and the World Bank, right? Particularly the IMF.
Shucks.
So we should be ready for another round of contestation with the IMF and the World Bank with regard to the kinds of conditionalities that they are going to put for the disbursement of the resources placed at their disposal. I think we'll stop here. Thank you very much indeed for your patience. And